and welcome to the Maplewood and South Orange Public Library's Banned Book Weeks panel discussion. My name is Keisha Miller, and I'm the head of youth services here at South Orange Public Library. And what has brought us together this evening is what banned books are and why they matter. And we're so happy to have all of our panelists here joining us this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amanda Eigen of Maplewood Library.
Good evening. I am Amanda Eigen. I'm the Assistant Director of the Maplewood Memorial Library. Before we get started, I'd like to thank South Orange Library for your partnership in this week's events. We reached out and said, hey, what are you doing Banned Books Week? And Keisha said, well, we've got this, this, and this. Come. And we were like, okay. So this is great. Thank you so much for your hospitality and partnership, really. Our next co-sponsored event is this Thursday at 4 p.m. and that is a children's open mic read aloud of challenged and banned books at the Hilton Branch Library. And that event is also co-sponsored by Soma Action. Throughout the week, teens and kids are welcome to stop by the Hilton Branch to write letters of support for State Bill S3907, which is the New Jersey Right to Read Act. I'm sure we will be touching on that a little bit in our conversation. And if you happen to be in Maplewood Village, please stop into Words to see their display of banned books. So welcome.
Thank you. So our authors this evening are very familiar faces, and to my immediate right is Eigen Zoboi, who is a household powerhouse of a name, if I must say so. I'm not fangirling. But Eigen Zoboi is a young adult author who has several awards behind her name. The Coretta Scott King Award, excuse me, namely for her most recent title, Star Child, which came out earlier this year. To Ibby's right is founder and director of the Library Freedom Project. That's Alison Macrina. And the Library Freedom Project, in case you're not aware, is a group of librarians that Alison has come together within the community to fight for intellectual freedom, to fight for the right to read whatever it is you want, and we'll get more into that certainly on this discussion. In our center here is Marietta Zacker, who is a literary agent and has edited a book that's right behind her, actually.
How about the quote?
She's also a library board member here for the South Orange Public Library, and Marietta will offer some interesting points of views from the agent and publisher's side as well. And then to Marietta's right is a good library friend of mine who I've been fortunate to work with, and also an award-winning author, Marina Budhos, who has several titles behind her name as well as awards. Amanda, Maplewood Library, South Orange Maplewood Community, we are so very fortunate. Tara, thank you so much for being behind this, Soma Action. Welcome to the Banned Books panel discussion. Why do they matter? Why we're all here to have this discussion. So we're going to keep this discussion very informal and conversational. We will open up the floor for questions, but we want to start with just a very general question, and I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to jumpstart things.
Thank you. So the origin of the panel and why we felt there was a need for this discussion, over the last year we've seen an increase in challenges and bans across the country, throughout New Jersey, and in nearby towns like Glen Ridge, Westfield, Cedar Grove. So my initial thought was not in my backyard, because I felt like it was really a point of information for our communities. And I think that this will really be a great conversation to inform you and hopefully give you some optimistic tools that you can leave with as well. Does everyone have a general understanding of challenged and banned books and what they are, difference between a challenge and a ban? Okay, a challenged book is, a challenge is an attempt to censor a book, and a ban is a successful challenge. Alison, why don't we start with you? can you give us a broad picture of what this moment looks like regarding banned books? And what is your organization seeing? What are libraries and communities struggling with?
Well, it's pretty bleak. I wish that I could tell you something hopeful or optimistic about it, but unfortunately, that's really not where we are right now. Basically, in every type of community, in every type of library, public libraries and school libraries getting hit the hardest. We're seeing attempts at banning books, all different kinds of challenges, pretty much primarily about 3 categories of books. So any LGBT material, books about the Black experience or Black history, and then anything about comprehensive sex ed. So in addition to the ban and challenge attempts, there's a whole other set of strategies that this movement is employing. So they're also taking over the boards of their local libraries. And by taking over, I mean they don't even necessarily have more than one person, but it's just an active enough, persistent enough person that they've sort of like wiped out any resistance. If they don't have the power of the board, they'll show up to the board meetings and make different demands. We've seen harassment campaigns against librarians as well as teachers. We've seen a lot of attempted legislation, so trying to redefine obscenity laws and also to attempt to criminalize just the professional work of the librarian, and then taking away the professionalization of the role. So trying to make it so that a small group of parents in any given community has the power to enact things like, what the collection development, like the book buying policy is. So it's in the whole country, and I think that's just, worth emphasizing that it's not just in like the deepest red states, it's not in the most rural places, it's in big cities, it's in left-leaning places too. And the last thing I'll say about it is that it's coming from an organized movement. That said, not everyone who is behind any of these bans or challenges is necessarily part of that movement, but that movement is seeding different kinds of propaganda, creating material that people can use so that even if there's an individual in the community that wants to go after the library in this way, that person is basically empowered to do so.
And I just want to touch on something you said about getting seats on the boards. There was a situation in Westfield where they had a book challenge that was successfully, it didn't succeed. The challenge did not succeed. But then one person who had been part of the group that was challenging the book then ran for the school board in Westfield, and nobody would have known who this person was except that a board member from the library board, who was also very involved with the Democrats of Westfield, and Westfield had never ever, this group of Democrats had never ever gotten involved with a school board election before. They jumped and got community involvement. They made phone calls, they did phone banking, they did flyers, they did everything, educating the base and the public to let them know. So I think your point that
And what happened?
they did not win a seat on the school board. Yeah. So I think your point that it extends beyond, and it's very important one. So Marietta.
Yes. I was just, I was there, I was just listening. Got I was on the panel for a second.
How does this surge in challenges and banning affect the publishing world, affect authors from the agent side? What's the trickle-down effect to our readers, especially our teen readers?
Right. So I think it sounds like we're going to start out bleak, but we're going to get hopeful later.
Yes.
But it's only because of the questions being asked. Because I think that there are solutions. I think that there is activism that we can all partake in. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But because I want to answer Amanda's question as a good panelist and get a medal myself.
Not all my questions are
I will say that, it's interesting because in publishing, it's a business, right? At the end of the day, as much as I think the publishers, editors that we work with want to publish good books for kids, right? And that's the field that I concentrate in. There's this kind of good feeling about everything that we're doing. But the reality is that at the end of the day, they need to sell books. That is their job, and they need to make money. That is their job. And what happens, I think, in publishing in particular, is not so much that they're banning, because the majority, a good number of people within publishing, certainly in the children's book world, will say that they're liberal, they are thinkers, they don't want to censor. But what happens is that there's conversations in-house about what's selling and what's not selling. And that's always a very tricky question, because they are not just selling to New York and to California, right? They're also selling in Kansas. And they have Scholastic Book Club, and they have, I can go on. And there's conversations about, well, maybe we should just kind of back off on some of these books that maybe aren't selling. It's like, wait. And then you see the rising from the agents, the editors, the people who are talking about it and saying, hold on a second, are you actually asking me to kind of self-censor on my own? And they're like, no, but. So there's this kind of back and forth. I have witnessed, or I have experienced more phone calls instead of emails about certain things that always make me go, how funny, I've had 3 calls this week with 3 different editors asking me whether or not we should postpone, or we should wait, or we should think about, or we should, and I'm like, and then of course there's that back and forth and trying to empower them to move forward, even though it's hard, because they are in the end against a business, right? They work for wonderful people sometimes, but then some people who are just there to run a business. So that's tricky. And then there is, of course, what happens with all of my clients, right? My authors and illustrators who go out and whose books are many times banned. And we always have this kind of joke that a book getting banned is kind of a good thing, quote unquote, because it brings attention, right? And as we all know from the world, any news is good news, or any kind of publicity is good publicity. But the reality is that these authors and illustrators have often a fear of, yes, it's good that maybe their book maybe had an uptick in sales because there are schools and or libraries who are now buying this book because it was banned, but they actually have to be the face of that book. If they go to a school event, if they go to a talk, if they have in a conference, and there are people who have purposefully are infiltrating all of those places to make sure that everyone knows that this book is not good for your child to read, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of stuff happening within publishing that is hard, and it takes up way more time than it should, given a lot of what's happening.
And that's a new phenomenon.
I think it comes and goes right now, and since, certainly since the uptick that you've seen in your own organization, it has definitely increased. And I was mentioning to some before this conversation that we spend a good percentage of the day talking about it, even amongst people who all believe that this is hogwash. And by hogwash, I mean it shouldn't be happening, right? But we have to spend a lot of time and resources figuring out what to do with this happening, and how do we talk to this person, and talking to the editors about, that kind of thing. So it does affect us in a lot of ways.
I'm going to toss it to Keisha.
Okay. Well, now that we got the conversation started with Alison and with Marietta, I'm going to turn it to Marina and Ivy, again, who are both young adult authors, and have them just introduce their philosophy, if you may, from the author's perspective on banned or challenged books. Like, what do either of you have any fears? I mean, if you were talking to some teens in the audience right now, like, what would you say to them, about writers who inspire kids to write stories? And you both write stories for teens, for the young adult audience, for them to see themselves in those stories. Like, do you add to that, or what is some more input on this?
Part of what's so hard about this conversation, and I'm sure that you must feel this, we've been at it for a while, and there was this feeling of incredible progress that was being made in terms of the stories that we're finally making it into the children's book world. I think that's part of the heartbreak for me right now, is that I felt like we had kind of changed the world, and we were changing the world, and we are changing the world by offering the kinds of stories that weren't there when I was growing up, and the kinds of characters and cultures and experiences and history. And so it is hard not to feel it as anything but a backlash against that, right? Because there has been a kind of vision, and a really exciting vision in children's books and young adult. So I think that's the first thing I feel is a bit of heartbreak, because this was really, you really felt like everything was opening and widening, and what I was, not just for myself, but what I was getting to see published and who was I was seeing published. So it is extremely, that's the bleak side, that's the discouraging side. I think as an author, when one goes out and speaks to young people, I think this feels like a lot of hoo-ha, a lot of nonsense to them. This is sort of like, you know, is it in the Peanuts card? You know, when the adults are, you know, because they're hungry for this, and they're so happy to have these stories, and yet there is this interference that is running. To say nothing of that young person for whom a book can save their life. I'm just going to give one anecdote that affected me sort of directly, indirectly, which was We Need Diverse Books has a grant called Books Save Lives. I think I've got the... And there was a teacher in Michigan who applied for the grant, won the grant, and what it is they sort of create a whole group of diverse books that this teacher then can bring into their library, right? It's a wonderful grant. And similar to what you were talking about, a new school board president had been voted in, and he was essentially successful in saying this teacher had no right to apply for this grant, and all of those books, they didn't really know what was in the books. My book was one of them, but there was a whole group of them would not be made available. So I think most recently, Samira Ahmed was speaking before the board. She was one of the authors. But I guess my point is, even if that was something that wasn't me showing up in a classroom or showing up at a library where I might feel it, the ripple is there for us, even as a category of writers that might be taken off shelves.
Oh, well, I'll start by saying that I'm still confused as to what a banned book is versus a challenged book versus a book that's taken off the curriculum versus a book that's taken off the school, the classroom library shelves, the school library shelves, or the branch library shelves. So it's layers of there's layers to this, and I truly believe when a book is challenged, it's brought up in a board meeting, there, readers or buyers or the educators, the administrators will hem and haw about whether or not to have the book in the first place. And we hear about the banned books, and yes, those books get attention, but there are other books that are also banned that don't get the attention. My book, American Street, has been, I believe it's banned. It's on that PEN America list. PEN America has a list, a spreadsheet of what books are banned, what districts have banned it, or whether it's banned or challenged. I know it's been banned in Pennsylvania, which is not too far from here. I had parents reaching out to me via social media to Zoom in on a board meeting because my book American Street was being challenged, and there was a whole article about it, and there was a video of a father reading passages of American Street. You hear him read it, it's kind of vulgar, but it's out of context. A lot of these challenges are out of context, and I have to say that, yes, most of the books being challenged are from underrepresented groups. And you are right, Marina, that we had Reading Diverse Books in 2015. I personally have been trying to get published my entire adult life since college, and it was because of Reading Diverse Book in 2015 that I was a debut author in 2017. And by 2015, I had already graduated from an MFA program for writing for children. I started in 2012 because I couldn't get through the door, and I thought that an MFA would get me through the door. Had I waited 3 years and not have to have the debt from it, the floodgates did open for many writers in a way that it didn't for a very long time. In 2020, about 3 of my books were either on the indie bestseller list or the New York Times bestseller list. And we all remember what happened in June of 2020. There were a whole bunch of Black books were on the bestseller list. We could never have imagined that exactly a year later that some of those same books would be challenged and banned. And there is a sort of pattern with that thing where there's 2 steps forward, 10 steps back when any sort of progress for racial equality or social justice in this country. Another lay I really want to say, and I don't talk about this, it is affecting our pockets. My sales went down drastically for my first 2 books, which were in the classrooms. I live in Maplewood because of making a living from writing, meaning it's book money that got me here, and I'm so grateful for that. However, now it's affecting me. When we now have the opportunity to really write what we want to write in terms of telling the truth about history and the perspectives of people of color and Black people and LGBTQIA people in this country, is when they want to shut that down. And it's almost par for the course with this country, and it's us authors who need to keep going. I think there's the hope that the children who don't get to read those books are then going to become young adults who are hungry for those books. And that's how revolution starts. And I don't mean revolution in a violent way, but in a sort of, you deprived us of this, so we're going to seek it out. And I think if we look at history, that tends to be what happens, where you have this constraint on what young people can do, what they can consume, and then a few years later they become the adults who are trying to burn it all down.
I think you've all touched on something which for us, I don't want to speak for Keisha, but I think I can say for us is, a critical point, which is, mantra, which is access. And providing access, offering access, and then denying access. And, so I would love to hear all of you speak a little bit about access and about what that means to you and how you see that affected. I'll get it started a little more, this is being a little vague, but Alison had mentioned, we're offering a lot of libraries, New York Public, Brooklyn Public, offering e-materials, e-books of all the challenged books across the country. Anyone can read them. What about the people who don't have Wi-Fi? Do you want to talk a little bit about?
I'll say something to that in terms of me growing up in a certain neighborhood in Brooklyn. That was a lot of neighborhoods in New York City across the country are book deserts, but there are absolutely libraries. Sometimes in some communities, as I had when I was growing up, libraries were not always safe spaces for children to be by themselves, or parents who don't have the time to take their children to the library, schools that don't have a school library, a librarian or a library. So when you take these even if you make these books accessible in that way, in terms of a ideological way, that you still have these books out in bookstores if they're not on the bookshelves, we have to consider the people who don't have those bookstores in their communities. And if they're not on the library shelves, if they're not in the school libraries, and they're still in bookstores, those people still don't have it. So I was saying in another interview that is a form of censorship, where you, even if it's out there in the world, but you remove access for a certain population, you are censoring that material for that population. Am I making it clear? Yeah.
I'm curious to know, and maybe this is sort of moving the conversation in a different direction. I'm curious to know, Allison, from your perspective, we have little free libraries, and that turned into a wonderful thing for a ton of people in communities across the country. You know, kids wanted to get books into the hands of other people, and they thought, okay, let's do little free libraries. In what capacity does your organization help kids and teens carry out this work? Because I'm interested to know that piece of it, but you're right, Ibby, it's going to be up to the kids now to carry on the mission of continuing these stories, of putting up the good fight. So in what ways does your organization, Allison, help other organizations, other hyper-local organizations, get books into the hands of readers?
Well, I think the Little Free Library piece is interesting, but I think it sort of speaks to Ibby's point that, like, some communities have great levels of access. You mostly see Little Free Libraries in wealthier or middle-class communities. The access issues that I'm particularly concerned about, everything that Ibby said, and also that even if the books that are being challenged don't rise to the level of getting banned, if those books make it back onto the shelf, what's happening in a much bigger way is an environment of extreme hostility against marginalized people. And so it's not simply that, it's not enough that the books get back on the shelves for the young people who need them, it's that now it has become increasingly, once again, socially acceptable to further marginalize LGBT people, Black people, people of color, immigrants, and so forth. And so that's why, I mean, in my organization, a lot of what we do is try to get people to look at that bigger picture. And everything you said, Marina, it is a backlash. It's a very deliberate anti-progressive backlash. The people who are behind it talk openly about this. I spend a lot of time in my capacity in LFP, like, following what the extreme right wing is doing. I do it so that you don't have to. Go to those parts of the internet. And they make no, you know, they say openly, like, we are doing this because there have been certain kinds of progressive gains that have happened. Because LGBT people get greater visibility now, we want to put them back in the closet. Because of all the racial justice protests that happened in 2020 and prior, we want to stifle that, and we want to also propagandize about what the goals of that movement were and, like, use it against the movement. So you see now, for example, how often, like, far right-wing people love to talk about, like, oh, well, you got your defund the police and now all the cities have all this crime, and it's like, that didn't happen, okay? Every police department in every major city actually saw a massive increase in their budgets. The police are engaging in a massive work stoppage in every city. They're just not doing their jobs, but that is getting a different point. What? Another panel, sorry, just, you know, soapbox. But anyway, those are that's the real, what gets at the access issues for me, is that we're talking about an environment of extreme hostility. And to Marietta's point about what we're going to, you know, how we're going to turn this into something positive, what we know is that when we show up against these people, we win every single time. We have to show up. We can't assume that, like, oh, just because it's actually a very small movement, because it is, it's not, they don't have the numbers, right? We actually have the numbers, but they're the ones who are going to the board meetings, and they're the ones who are protesting the LGBT story time. and they're the ones who are harassing the librarians and all this other stuff. So when in situations where people show up against that and they show up in numbers, we defeat them every time. Now, one more thing I want to say on that is that opposition movement, they are not often deterred by defeat. They're going to have to get their butts kicked like over and over again for something really to happen, in part because a lot of them, they are Christian nationalists. They do believe that they're ordained by a God to impose their will on other people through force. So if they lose, they just kind of redirect. They think, okay, well, we're going to try a different strategy, and they're very good at their strategies. So we need to think of this as a longer term fight too. We're not going to allow them to claw back all the gains that we've made in the last decade or so.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say that I think another piece of this, because it is clearly such a very focused propagandizing movement. I think there was an article in the Washington Post where they did an analysis of something like 400 challenges, and they actually came from 11 people. So, you know, it is this very, very vigilant minority group. And I think when I'm not feeling heartbroken, what I try to think about is there are so many latent allies in this, because I think part of what's happened is we didn't know we had to defend in this way. And again, for me, leading up to this was kind of, to me, a renaissance of what was going on in terms of the stories that were finally getting published. So we sort of thought we had the wind at our backs, but I think what one has to start thinking about is, where are the natural allies for people who didn't know they had to defend this? And I think one area of, clearly teachers in many ways, so they are very, very demoralized because they're especially in states like Texas and many of the states, and even within New Jersey, there is this atmosphere of fear. But I do think another natural ally are parents, right? Because I don't think they've ever been asked to defend or to talk or have a frank and open conversation about what you want in terms of reading for your children. And I think most parents would not want to see this. They don't know they have to defend this. So I think we have to start thinking about, when we think about the layers, it's also thinking about the latent allies that are there, that haven't really been activated in a way, that we have to have some real conversation about what's going on.
I agree.
As well as supporting, like you said, the parents, supporting the librarians in schools and in towns, and the boards that are doing the job of, I hope, having conversations about, do we have any policies? If our librarian is faced with a challenge, what do they do, right? And I think it's a given for all of those, you know, because of what Marina, exactly what you said, you don't know you need these things because, of course, my child, go read. But if you're faced with that, and it might be one person, right, but that can cause a whole lot of headache and a lot of problems for the librarian who has to deal with that, right, and the director of the library, and, you know, so supporting all of that and showing up and understanding that we do have to weirdly pay attention to something that seems to many of us so ridiculous that it's even happening.
I think that's true, and I think there was a poll that I saw recently, it might have been PEN America, that was, I think, over 80% of parents polled said they did not want any books taken off their children. They didn't want their children protected materials or books banned. And I would like to say at this moment that at the Maplewood Library September board meeting, Maplewood Library Board of Trustees followed Hoboken and proclaimed Maplewood Library a book sanctuary library. So I think that's one way in which our libraries can help, our parents can help, because that in and of itself, being on the website, alerting people, it is a point of education and information. So let's talk about libraries for a minute. Marietta, you brought it up. What role do you see libraries playing in all of this? How can they be effective? How can boards be effective? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that, you know, the libraries are that, this is the lasting free, democratic institution where anyone can walk in and really have access to all the things, not just on the shelves, but via computer and all of that. So I think having that understanding that, and I've talked to a lot of people, in part because I'm on the board, but a lot of people who say, well, yeah, the library, it'll always be there. I'm like, well, have you been to board meetings? You know, and it's not because anyone is actively trying to dismantle the library, certainly not here in South Orange or Maplewood, but you know, budgets are tight in towns, and you know, the money has to come from somewhere. The library just doesn't operate on its own. So understanding that as citizens and as community members, we have to back it up, whether it's with dollars if you can do that, or by showing up, or by attending things, or by making sure that the librarians or the director, that everyone that's part of this institution is supported and understands that we've got your back. Right? This doesn't just exist without any kind of support. So I think that's a huge part of it. And I think as community members, I think in our towns, we are used to both being active, but also sitting back and thinking, well, it's never going to go away. And I don't think it actually will, but there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes that we all need to support. So I think that's one of the big parts of it. And given that both of our towns are experiencing a renaissance in their libraries with the state grant that we received, they both received, and with the construction that's happening. I mean, even people who support the library have asked me, well, do we really need that? I'm like, oh, we do, come join us. So I think it's having those conversations with everyone so that people don't take it for granted, because I think that's an easy thing to do in our towns.
The library question. You know, I have a fraught relationship with libraries. When we're talking about access, the question about access, I am still thinking about my own childhood in Brooklyn in the 80s, if anybody knows New York City in the 80s, and those communities like the one I grew up in and still exist. For me, I did not often come to the library simply because I loved books and I needed to keep them. When I found a book, I kept it, and my mom accumulated library fees. I know some places have done away with library fees, so it was a point of contention in our household where I did not want to let go of books because I did not know how to purchase books. And because my mother didn't have a home library other than the Encyclopedia Britannica. My point is, I think for many communities, home library and the public library is a conversation that needs to be had, because there's also the conversation of reading culture in the home. Otherwise, a library then becomes a space where, yes, you use the internet and the books are collecting dust, you know, not here, but just this idea of a renaissance of reading culture, which I thought was happening with, you know, all these books by marginalized authors being published. I can't think about anything that is happening with the library without also thinking about reading cultures in the home. Some years ago, I had met a woman. She said it was too hard to run a non-for-profit that was called Read to Me. And she would get volunteers to go out into people's homes who had young children and read to them, basically, to help develop a reading culture in a, you know, within a household that does not have that. And it sounds so simple, and if we can easily overlook it, you know, based on, you know, depending on where we're coming from socioeconomically. But that's what I have to say. Reading culture in libraries are a conversation that needs to be happening simultaneously within, for, and about certain communities.
So, off of that, what can we do right now? And this is for all of our panelists. What can we do right now? What gives you some hope or optimism going forward? So we'll start with that. In this very bleak time of fighting for the very right to read. You know, we talk about reading culture and getting, you know, sort of introducing books to kids and families and whomever. We want to foster that, but what do we do right now that'll give us some hope going forward? Like what can we do?
Well, a lot of this, there's multiple terrains that this is playing out on, and there's a space for everyone in this. One thing is you can join your library's board. If they don't have an open seat, you can like look up and see when that happens. If they're appointed here, okay, so figure out who appoints them and then like bother that person. I was at a library, I was speaking to some librarians in Wisconsin who also have library board appointments in that part of Wisconsin, and one of their like strongest oppositional community members who has challenged the most books got on the board because she harassed the city supervisor enough and he appointed her. So you could be that person for the good. So if you can't get on your library's board, show up at the board meetings, even if there isn't anything going on, because you want to ask them, are they ready to handle this environment, this challenge environment, and what are they doing to get ready for it? I would also just in various ways show support to your library. I mean, you're all here right now, so great job. But librarians are really having a bad time right now. I just heard from a librarian in Nashville who told me that she's leaving the profession after multiple challenges happened at her library, and the literal KKK is flying in that neighborhood. Things are really bad. Librarians need to hear from supportive community members just to voice their support, especially if there are libraries in the area that have received some challenges, or maybe like there's some contention. And also, you know, so much of this is happening at the legislative level, so like being aware of what is going on in local politics, you know, what kind of bills are being introduced, who is running for office, who, you know, just mapping out who these different people are and what kind of agenda they have.
Excuse me, earlier you mentioned there's a law proposed in New Jersey. Can you tell me the neighborhood again?
Sure, so that's State Senator Andrew Zwicker has brought a bill for the New Jersey Right to Read Act. If that bill passes,
You don't know the number, do you?
It is, I do, S3907. And that bill it effectively bans banning books. In public institutions, thank you. A piece of that is also that places where books are banned, they will lose their state funding if they follow through with any kind of book ban. So,
And those can't, well, I don't want to get in the weeds, but it couldn't be grandfathered in, the book ban. Like, oh, you banned this book, but now you're not going to ban anymore, so we'll still give you money. You don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that New
That's
Jersey
getting in the weeds.
That's okay. New Jersey Library Association and the state library are working with the senator to make sure that all the language and that the legislation goes through as we want to go through. Do you know anything? Anyone want to?
I was going to jump to something.
You want to? Oh, go ahead.
In the Hilton branch of the Maplewood Library, all this week we have a letter writing station where you can learn about the bill, write, and we're going, at the end of the week, we're going to collect everything by senator and just mail it all to them.
Did you want that to be just for kids or anybody?
Anybody.
You've got one person coming. I was going to suggest something that may seem simplistic, but I truly feel that it gets at the core of all of this is your children, your grandchildren, your nieces or nephews, go to their school's open house or their back to school night and look at the library, at the teachers and ask the teachers, what are you missing here? What do you need? and then go get it for them. Teachers are exhausted. You all know that from either reading or from watching your own significant others, you know, your family's life. It is a, it goes back to their point about we need diverse books, and not that that was the end-all be-all, but it certainly gave the publishing industry and writers and illustrators a mechanism to do something that had never been done in publishing. We can have a whole other panel about publishing and what has been published over the many years and what has not been published. We Need Diverse Books helped do that, and the amount of time that we spent talking to teachers about what's missing in their classrooms and what, not just because they don't have the dollars, but because they don't have the time. You know, again, go and ask them what's there, or take a look and just say, I don't see, you know, or you know, and it's not to call them out. Many of them do want those in the classrooms but don't have it. So I think there is something to be said about proactively helping those who are in charge of the children for most of the day, giving them the right tools. Certainly, starting at the home and having that kind of culture is one thing, right? And that's a whole other, again, another panel, right? Talking about how do we get literacy within the homes and helping parents who may not have the time and they may not have the resources to be able to read to their children in that way. But again, children go to school, and they go to school for a long period of time. So getting into those classrooms and just asking those questions of those teachers, and asking the librarian, what are you missing here? And helping them brainstorm how to do that. And by the way, not only in Maplewood and South Orange, but one of the things that we do is talk to the schools in our neighboring towns. And I connect with a lot of teachers. You know, I happen to benefit from receiving a lot of the books, receiving all the books that we publish, or that the publishers publish on behalf of our clients. And we have sometimes an abundance of books, and not only do I make sure that these libraries have those books, in part because we have too many, but going elsewhere and seeing if you can be helpful in that way. So keeping your eye on that and helping in that way, I think, is a great way of making sure that those books, that those library shelves are stacked with the right, with a diverse group of books.
A question mainly to the two authors. Two authors. Do you find yourself, or in talking with other authors, do you find them saying that they're modifying what they're creating because of the controversies, because of your concern that your sales went down dramatically after there were some attacks?
Oh yeah, I did that recently. I pivoted. I shelved the manuscript because of my last. You know, as with all artists, there's you know, the lean years and the fat years.
Right.
So it's not to say that for every book that I write, I expect the same level of success. But yes, I did start out writing social justice books, and I have rethought that very recently. So I am venturing into fantasy. I'm glad I've had the skills to like pivot in that way, but I did have to think about my next sale and my sell after that to take a look at the climate, and that's a business move. What Marietta was saying, there's the art, and we also have to think about the comments, and the publishers have their bottom line. And a way that, while my books are getting published, I haven't had any manuscripts rejected. What's happening is they will publish it, but the marketing may not be there. So it is sort of just a silent censoring a little bit, right?
No, they do.
And you know, and they'll say, well, people are not buying, well, you didn't market it, and you know, we're not going to market that, in, you know, in this climate. So it is affecting their bottom line, which affects our livelihoods. And I personally, being who I am, with, you know, my worldview, I have to be flexible in that way and be really smart about how I continue doing what I love, regardless of what's happening in the social climate. I'll slip it in there somehow. I think fantasy can be a great metaphor. Speculative fiction can be a great metaphor, and I don't have to rely on the contemporary, whatever's happening in the real world all the time. I can slip it in very easily, you know, I'm not stopping, are you?
No, but I think you're hitting something that I've just been thinking a lot about tone, sort of trying to think about the tone that I'm using. I think there was a more hard-hitting tone that I was interested in 10 years ago, and I'm trying for something a little sweeter. It's not that I don't have the same, I presume the same worldview is going to will be there no matter what, and it will, but I think there is this way in which as an artists have always had to do this, writers have always had to do this, and I have to say this is a very weird junction for writers right now. I mean, many of you are aware that the writer's strike happened in Hollywood, and this other thing that's happening with AI, where, so we're in such a strange, yes, another, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's a really hard and strange moment to be a writer, where on the one hand, you're obviously so valuable, they're mooching from your work to spit it out in AI, right? And they sort of want to steal from you without attribution and without remuneration. At the same time, we're facing this kind of chilling, everything from chilling to outright banning. So it's a very peculiar time to be navigating. And, you know, I'm with Ivy, it affects us literally directly. You know, it affects our financial well-being. And it's not that all of you are responsible for our financial well-being, but it means we have to find a way to navigate and figure out, I'm just thinking about tone, kind of reaching people through, perhaps there's other tones I haven't thought of.
Emily Dickinson's Tell It Slant.
Exactly. But we're in a very, I think writers are in a very odd place right now.
And if I can give you an insight into my day-to-day, I have conversations with many of my clients throughout the day, and it is us understanding that point of view and absolutely supporting what they need to do in order to make a living, and yet pushing them to be the artists that they naturally are, and having them say, or telling them, no, stay the course, do the thing, and yet understanding that I'm going to have 6 more conversations with the editors and the publishing houses because they're going to self-censor to some degree despite wanting this to happen. So it is this constant, we'll say, dance of sorts where I absolutely, first and foremost, my responsibility is to my clients and to make sure that they are whole in whatever way that means for them, but also not wanting to sacrifice the art and what they do so well. And to be fair, we happen to have 2 authors who know how to pivot pretty well. I have clients who, it's not that they are worse authors or anything, but they don't pivot in that way. And you know, I couldn't show you the royalty statements, but I can tell you that what Evie said is absolutely factual, that if I put side by side what happened over the past certainly 6 months, where we're just, and it is stark, it is clear, there is no question about it. So when people say to me, well, but are they really being affected, or that, don't they get the spike from the ban or whatever? They are, it is absolutely affecting how they live every single day.
And I want to add to that, it's affecting us financially. What happens, we write for children. I personally am not relying on individual sales. I am relying on school and library sales. Schools buy units when it's on the curriculum. Right. A district, an entire district, school district, will buy a book if it's on the curriculum. If it's no longer on the curriculum, we're not talking hundreds of sales here. We're talking thousands of sales, at least for me. So that's where it affects children's writers the most.
And think, if you think just, high school curriculum, right?
Yeah.
The schools where they have all the classics, where, that has to be read, there's a lot of conversation, yet another panel where, well, those are the classics, so we have to teach it to the children. Do we? Because many of them, if you ask them, will call BS on that. They do not want to read these books, And in the past, not so long ago, there was this push towards introducing new books, more modern books, more books that will actually speak to children. and then there's this backlash of the book banning, where it's being rolled back. It's like, well, you know, J.D. Salinger, and it's like,
all white people.
I mean, no question about it. And they're like, oh, well, no, now we're good, now we're good. I'm like, has anyone read those in a while?
Yeah.
Because I have again, and I'm like, oh, right? And what we have in our minds that, well, those are good, wholesome books that are great. They're not. They are by white authors for white kids, period, end of sentence. That's truly if we want to get down to it. So we have to really, again, go into the schools and see what they're teaching and talk about that curriculum, because Evie's right. That's where, really and truly, that's how the authors make the big, you know, a living out of it.
I'm curious if you can shed any light, like, from like the publishing standpoint of sort of the other, so I work at a school and I'm like involved in curriculum development, but we've come across like publishers that won't publish certain like reading and writing curriculums for elementary because their markets are like Texas or
Well, I was just going to say,
Right.
welcome to Texas.
Right.
I mean, Texas
because
dictates the curriculum for
curriculums
this
are
place.
considered like too woke. And they know, like they don't care, they just, like Heinemann just wants to make money, so they won't publish because they're not gonna sell it. So, yeah, like, I don't know, I mean, I don't
That's a
know the
whole
question.
other,
It's
so
right,
the textbook
right.
industry
Right.
is, but
or
you're
it's like
absolutely
curriculum.
right.
It's like how you're teaching kids how to like
So the
read or
textbook
write.
industry has always been dominated in part by Texas.
Mhm.
And some of you know that there is legislation, I think, moving forward in Texas to have absolutely no relationship, like to sort of sever with the ALA, the American Library Association, right? In other words,
Oh my God.
we as a state will have nothing to do with the ALA. So it just shows you, so unfortunately Texas, certain state, well, California also has an outsize, but it's these big states, because from a textbook publisher's point of view, they have to publish X number of textbooks, let's say. And because Texas is such a huge market, it has an outsized effect on the textbook
right.
market, alas,
It's
as part of what's
education
going on.
industrial
Right.
complex.
So I would like Alison to speak to this for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
About you touched on ALA.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if we could just talk about
Probably know
that
the
for a
exact-
moment. So ALA, the American Library Association, has a new president, Emily Drabinsky, and I will go to Alison to take it.
Yeah, so this is another strategy of the opposition. So there's two things going on. One is about Emily. So Emily Drabinsky is our current ALA president. She's a friend of mine and a good colleague. The position is largely ceremonial, and I think that's important to note because she doesn't have any real power in the organization. However, she won by a landslide. Everyone loves her. She's an amazing librarian, a labor organizer, and they're now, she's in her term right now, but the way that the terms work is like you get elected and then you don't take office until another year. Anyway, when she first won her election, she fired off kind of like a jokey tweet that was like, I can't believe a Marxist lesbian like me is now the ALA president. My mom is so proud, right? So the right has really gone in on that tweet repeatedly.
And this tweet was like a year?
It was 2 years ago.
Yeah, but they are just now.
So the first thing that happened was the state of Montana. So every state, the way that libraries are governed and funded is a little bit different, but most states have like a state library commission that maybe makes some funding decisions on behalf of the state for all the public libraries. So the Montana State Library Commission voted to remove themselves from ALA because of Emily's comments. And they didn't even just say, oh, it's because she's a Marxist. They said it's because she's a Marxist lesbian. So they're saying the quiet part out loud in all kinds of ways now. So not that it would have been okay the other way, right? It's worse though. Montana was quickly followed by a number of other states. So Texas has, I believe, also their state library commission has voted to leave ALA, and there are a bunch of other states, basically the ones that you would think like that have these like freedom caucuses. So Pennsylvania, where I live, is talking about it. what this really means is about taking away library funding, because that's really the primary function of these state library commissions, and the relationship of ALA. There's some money that comes through ALA. It's, you know, all of this is about these people actually don't want the library to exist at all, and they're taking bricks out of the building doing this. There are other, unrelated to the ALA stuff, there have been a number of states that have, through this opposition movement, have defunded their libraries, where the libraries are now closed. So like, yeah, libraries are not gonna be forever unless we make them so. The other part of this that has, it started prior to Emily's presidency, is that the opposition movement had already identified ALA as an enemy. Because ALA has certain ethical guidelines about how like libraries don't we like allow children the right to read, basically. There's all these specific things that means, but the opposition doesn't like that, and so already had kind of painted the American Library Association as like woke, or like frankly much worse things. They say all kinds of like really insidious things about like grooming children or whatever. You might remember that they did the same thing to the American Medical Association. They don't have like, you know, respect or anything for like sort of big professional institutions. So any entity that like has moved forward with the rest of society on different kinds of progressive gains is now made an enemy of them.
So what's the strategy for fighting back?
Well, I mean, for which part of it? Like,
I mean, to go after the ALA strikes me nuts.
I mean, I think like,
I mean, the ALA
so
must have a plan for, you know, other than.
ALA is not really responding to the moment with the ferocity that we wish they would have. They like to respond and say things like, well, these people just don't know what libraries are for. Well, yes, they do, and they're against, right? And so I think ALA is they're in a tough position where like they have to be the sort of like professional ones. The opposition gets to say whatever they want. They get to lie, they get to harass, they get to do whatever, and then librarians and the ALA, we're in such a tough spot because we're at work, and we can't be overtly political in different ways, or we're more risk averse, and it's understandable. But I think that, I mean, we just have to reject this narrative, and we have to be careful not to be in a defensive position where it's like, oh well, the ALA is not like, they're not grooming kids, they're not doing this. Just reject it entirely. I support my librarian, and I support the work of libraries generally, and like I think libraries are amazing and great, and like turn it into a positive narrative. I would say that is the sort of broad strategy there.
And I think exactly that. I think supporting the directors of the libraries and the librarians that work for them to make sure, because they're the ones who are members of the American Library Association, right? So they have a seat at the table.
Well, I'd like to think that those of us in Maplewood South Orange support our libraries for the most part. But what about those poor people in Montana? I mean, we write our congressperson? No, that doesn't probably do any good. I mean, I don't know. It's outrageous to me. I get Texas and its textbooks, that's in it also, but this is...
There are a number of different nationwide efforts. One that just immediately comes to mind is a great group called Libraries for the People. And basically, it's a nationwide group of really dedicated volunteers that are mapping out the whole terrain of library boards. So like, where are there open seats? How do people get on them? Where are they elected? Where are they appointed? Volunteers are what create their databases of like where all these seats are open. They also are doing recruiting for people to get on their boards in different states. They make really amazing talking points for if you want to go speak at your board meeting, the kinds of things, like exactly what we were just talking about, like turning it into the positive agenda. So that's one such group. You know, I would say like you know, there are local groups of all different varieties, like working on these things, and, you know, we can support them with our money, and we can support them also with like just reaching out and saying that we see them and we see what they're going through. So those are the ideas that I have on that.
You know, I did want to mention one hopeful story. My husband teaches in the Rutgers Library. He's a young adult author, but he also teaches in the Rutgers Library School. And so there's a lot of conversations that are going on because they are training librarians, right? And it's a library school where people are coming from all over and even internationally because some of it is online. And so they've obviously had to start baking into the curriculum, what do you do in these situations, right? With all of these challenges, and they bring in speakers and various people. And he told a really interesting story of a librarian in Louisiana who was facing a challenge. And what she kind of realized is she had to develop a new set, a skill set that many librarians would not normally, when they went to library school, they did it out of a love of books. But she realized that the person who was sort of leading the charge in all the ways that you were talking about, is like one person who had all the propaganda, she began to sort of, she realized she had all these community relationships. And she began to sort of talk to the parents and talk to the school people involved in the schools. And she actually had the local community relationships. And she realized that was her job. Her job was to cultivate those relationships, such that when the challenge finally came up, she'd kind of laid this groundwork. So I think on some level, you know, at least that, to me, that was one of the most optimistic stories I had, that within the you know, it's now kind of baked into being a librarian, that those community relationships and that sort of beefing up that support, which is almost your inoculation against what really a very often outside elements coming in, is part of what, because sometimes on this large scale, it's hard to figure out what you can do.
And I think you're speaking to preparedness, which we are learning in the library world is absolutely critical. And knowing that we have our reconsideration policy in place, we have the support of the board, our board is educated and willing, and having a reconsideration policy that requires Maplewood a local address, because the challenge could come from anywhere. We've kept you all very long. I think we have time for one more question, just to close it out, if there is one. Aola.
Yes, so as this book banning situation is happening, there's also a lot of like misinformation that's happening in terms of like people like self-publishing ebooks that are about weird things or making memes, like spreading all kinds of lies on the internet. So what do you see as the relationship between book banning and misinformation?
So for those of you who couldn't hear, what is the relationship, what do we see as the relationship between book banning and misinformation?
I'll just say very quickly, I think one informed the other. One absolutely informed the other, and this is not surprising, sadly, that given what happened in the presidency before us, that we are where we are. This is actually, to me, it's a direct result. So I think that they go hand in hand, and I think the one comfort that I take is that in the very small world in my own home, that my children, who are 2 in college and 1 in high school, have very active conversations about this and do some of the same things that we were talking about before, that they are, and by the way, yes, they are the answer, but that does not give us the pass to not be there, for the record, because I know we said that, but let's just be clear that yes, our children are going to have to take the mantle and they're going to have to run with it, but we've got a lot of work to do, and the adults are the ones who are doing all of the so let's just be clear on that, but we're having conversations about that, and I think that there are many young adults, at least that I've seen, that who are ready to have that conversation, who are having them even within their own circles. So.
Well, we can certainly go on with this, and I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining us this evening. Zoboi, Alison Macrina, Marietta Zacker, host, and my co-host, Amanda Eigen, and I'm Keisha Miller. We are so happy to have you all not the last conversation, I can assure you.
Marietta gave us like 17 ideas.
No, I pointed them out. I just pointed them out while we were all talking. I'm like, there's another one, there's another one.
That's another panel, no. So thank you all very much, and I just want to say, you know, on behalf of my colleagues who are librarians and some who are in the audience, thank you for writing this. Bless our team. I think a lot of people have heard me say it before, you know, kids come in here, although they're not coming in as much as I'd like as far as teens go, but I always ask them, I'm like, what is your literary appetite? So when you talk about switching, you know, having a pivot, you know, going from, you know, realistic fiction to fantasy, I ask them, like, what are you in the mood for? You know, tonight's broccoli, tomorrow's pizza, fantasy, realistic fiction, and you know, that's how I'm able to sort of open up the conversation. So having, you know, you all and so many others write stories, you all are the people that all of us grew up with. You know, the Toni Morrisons and the Maya Angelou's and the James Baldwins, and that's who you are for our kids now. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for being here. And if you have any other questions, sure you can find everybody on social media. And we did record this, so once it's available, you can watch it and share it with your folks on our YouTube channel. So everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.